Brand new metagame, brand new decks. Let's take a look at what people are playing and where I think this metagame is going to go on day one. For me, the immediate most successful deck was Move Bounce, which is weird because Move Bounce wasn't exactly a deck that was being held back by a lot of combo decks, but it is a deck that can get to massively high levels of points. If anything, this deck was being held back by competition, the competition coming from other move decks, playing Cosmo and Eliath and Heimdall and things of that nature. It looked like that version of the move build was solidifying itself as the dominant move build, but with the loss of Cosmo from those decks, people are revisiting Move Bounce, and Move Bounce is doing some real work. This felt like a really solid pick to me because as a baseline in a metagame that had a lot of tech removed from it, it doesn't necessarily mean that nobody is playing tech decks, but what it does mean is that people haven't found the perfect shells for them right now, so making a bunch of numbers is very, very incentivized. If I had to guess the direction this metagame was going to go, I would suggest that it goes in the numbers direction right up until it stops going in the numbers direction. Now, the tech cards that stayed around are actually quite good against what would normally be competitors to this deck in the numbers department. Mr. Negative, of course, still has Mobius as a predator, and Hela, of course, still has Stardust as a predator. In fact, I ran into plenty of people playing both of those cards, so even in a metagame that supposedly has tech removed from it, there is still going to be the outlines defined by what people can successfully play and get away with. And I think that is largely what this deck is expressing. It is doing a lot of points, so it's able to compete with every other deck that's doing a lot of points. And weirdly, I almost think this is sort of the direction the metagame was going in anyway. We saw the discard deck succeeding at Golden Gauntlet, and now you have a deck that basically stat checks the discard deck, is able to do some very, very, very large numbers thanks to a Human Torch. And frankly, without the access to Invisible Woman, Killmonger, Shadow King stuff, I'm not exactly sure what the move is to beat it. I do think that this deck is quite powerful, but I also think that it's a bit harder to target, and it would be hard to target anyway, which is largely the problem with Move Bounce in the first place. Maybe we'll see a little bit more Mercury. The other thing that this deck does very well is it does well at beating Clog. And I think those two dynamics are quite important. With the advent of a metagame with not a lot of reactive tech-based answers to problems, you get people wanting to do proactive responses to problems. One of the ways to proactively beat a combo deck, or really any deck that is trying to do a lot of points, is to use Clog cards. We'll be talking about Clog almost immediately after this because it is the other deck that has really risen up in my estimation. Because if you think of Clog as sort of preemptive dealing with a combo, preemptive dealing with a large amount of points, it makes a lot of sense why people will have immediately gone in that direction. Having bounce cards in your deck makes you inherently a lot better in those matchups, and it felt to me like it was pretty favored against basically any Clog deck and had the numbers to compete with a lot of the combo. So let's talk about what Clog actually looks like right now. This is what I would describe as the baseline Clog list. It's the cards that say what they are on them. They do things that clog your opponent. And the reason Clog is going to be a bigger presence in this metagame, at least until people start meaningfully dealing with it, is because of the dynamic with tech cards. Tech cards are reactive problem solvers, especially a lot of the ones that got nerfed. These are cards that were able to solve problems after those problems appeared on the board. Without access to those, people will instead go to proactive problem solvers like Clog, solving problems before they appear on the board. Now, this inherently has less of a point ceiling, or a cube ceiling, I should say, than a reactive tech card. A lot of the reason reactive tech cards are regarded the way that they are is that they are typically best deployed late in the game when cubes have doubled. These are turn 6 cards, Shang-Chi and Shadow King and Enchantress. That is typically how they are perceived. And that is why their value is so high. In large part, Clog loses a decent amount of that. This is a deck you have to snap aggressively, or when you don't get your points, you're not going to be actually doing anything. If you are not getting a bunch of 2-cubers with this deck, you are probably going even, getting +1, -1. Now, this deck does have a lot of inherently inbuilt wins in it against decks that are not prepared for it, but the decks that are prepared for it can very easily swap it back over to you. The other thing that made Clog a lot better, and especially Debris a lot better, and of course Kate Bishop a lot better, is Killmonger is now no longer freeing every lane up. So I do think that if you can afford to be a Merlin deck right now, if you can afford to be a Kitty Pryde deck right now, if you can afford to be a Jeff deck right now, if you can afford to do any sort of due diligence towards being a Clog deck right now, towards beating a Clog deck right now, that could be very valuable for you. Speaking of due diligence towards beating Clog decks, one of the best ways to win Clog mirrors is with cards like Cersei and Annihilus and, of course, Merlin. Being a Clog deck that has all these cards in it makes you very, very favored in mirrors against people who are playing other Clog decks, and in that way, Clog decks can tend to kind of eat each other a little bit. This kind of stuff makes playing Clog mirrors super fraught, because not only are you both Magic decks that have Merlin, one of you might have Annihilus, one of you might not have Annihilus, one of you might have Cersei, the other one might not have Cersei. There's just kind of a lot of dynamics to consider. It makes priority on the later turns especially fraught when you're looking at like, oh, it's turn 6, but they might turn off the limbo. There's a lot going on in these mirrors. And I think generally positioning yourself as the Clog deck that beats the other Clog decks will be rewarded fairly early on in this metagame at least. This is the other direction you can go, a very low to the ground Clog list from Butt, emphasizing the Silver Surfer First Steps ability to double up on on reveals. Silver Surfer First Steps Debris, pretty gross. Being able to have a bunch of debris things that then feed your Strange Supreme, pretty gross. That kind of stuff is very, very reasonably powerful. I don't know how it stacks up compared to the Clog decks that are willing to actually get Annihilus in there. The mirrors, I think, will still be fraught, but I would suspect that the Annihilus decks end up a little bit better off. The reason this deck is all-inning Debris is a lot because your opponent can't Annihilus it back to you. If your opponent is playing Annihilus, that's great for them, but they can't stop rocks. They can't send over rocks. They can send your Green Goblin back, and that sucks. So you want to invest as much as possible in the Clog stuff that can't get Annihilus, which is how you end up at this kind of list. Shang-Chi isn't around very much anymore, so you can very easily play a Surtur list and really go to town on people as long as they are not able to get bigger than you. This kind of deck is the one that sort of sets the preconditions for the decks that we previously talked about existing. Clog eats this deck alive. You have the move bounce deck that can just absolutely stat check it to the absolute end of the game. There are things that you can do, and having a consistent large level of point output is good. Like, decks like this will eat, say, Invisible When First Steps decks that are relying on Stardust and Mobius still, will eat them alive, but I'm not sure it wants that, because if it eats the Stardust and Mobius decks, there's not going to be a lot to protect it from the decks that go even taller than it. It's not really a deck that can afford to play that kind of stuff. It's got room for one tech card. That card is Enchantress, and that's it. So you can tens all over people, but it is a little bit risky. I tried a couple of different builds of Invisible When First Steps, and largely found that I wanted to invest more heavily in points, although Marvel Boy was fairly mediocre. I don't think I found the perfect combination of points and interaction for a deck like this, but Juggernaut is still a very powerful card, and you can interact with a wide variety of things thanks to Thing First Steps if you are able to do that. Having the Prodigy Invisible Woman First Steps line back in here allows us to be more invested in having a bunch of points, which is important because there are a lot of decks that are no longer being held back by potential worries about Killmonger and Shang-Chi, so now we need our own Sunspot that does like 30 points in order to compete with them. We need that stuff in the deck, and having that stuff back is actually quite important to this metagame. I just don't think I've gotten to the exact right list yet. There's an inherent conflict between being a Prodigy deck and being a Thing First Steps deck, and I haven't solved it, obviously, and I think Thing First Steps and Marvel Boy are where I would start messing around here if I had to guess, but I also wonder if there's not just like a more all-in version of this deck that is just looking to do a billion points as much as it possibly can. Speaking of a billion points, there's not a lot holding Wong back right now, which is a weird sentence. This deck previously got housed by so many things, but a lot of the things that ruin a Wong deck, Red Guardian, that got nerfed. Cosmo got nerfed. Shang-Chi got nerfed. Shadow King got nerfed. All of the stuff that normally stops this deck from functioning got nerfed, which means for now, at least, I do believe you can play something along these lines and do fairly well with it. You can put big numbers on the board. Your opponent probably won't have the tools to interact with you. Eventually, though, like decks like this, there does come a reckoning, right? this deck can only be the best deck for so long because there are still cards that beat your ass, right? People can still play the 4/6 Cosmo if they run into this enough and keep losing to it. People can play Cosmic Ghost Rider if they run into this enough and keep losing to it. It does powerful things, but you are genuinely unlikely, I think, to stay at the top of the metagame when a target is this clear cut. It is not a hard deck to beat, but nobody is willing to try to beat it right now, which makes it a better deck. This is not a permanent state of affairs, though, so don't expect it to be. My arch nemesis KM Worst has been doing very well with this Scream deck, which strikes me as odd because it is not trying to do much beyond here's a bunch of points and I have some minor interaction here, but the decks it's going against are so unrefined and the minor interaction that it has is so weirdly relevant to a lot of what's happening that it ends up being kind of okay. This is a deck that, since it's a Scream deck, kind of naturally has a pretty okay matchup into Move Bounce. Since it's moving a lot of cards around, it kind of has a good matchup into Clog. Since it has this disruption available to it, you can clog up people that are doing all one lane things, like Wong decks, for example. You can just really mess them up by moving their cards around, right? There's a shocking amount of just natural things going right for this deck right now. Oh, look, my opponent is trying to get a Scar onto the board. It would be a shame if their 10 power guy actually had 8 power, so their Scar doesn't get discounted, right? Like, there's just kind of a lot. It just has some natural upsides in this metagame. It's weird. Like, I wouldn't have expected it to happen, but when you look at what we're talking about in this video, you can start to see why this is happening, right? Like, when we talk about a metagame that is being shaped by those things, this deck just sort of randomly has good options into them for no good reason, just kind of accidentally it does. And so you end up with a deck that actually kind of does a lot of work right now. Cerebro gamers are largely in shambles right now, in part because a lot of what the use case of Cerebro was being a deck that stomped all over the mid-rangey interactive decks by saying, like, look, idiot, you can't interact with my stuff, I have more points than you. Whether that was through Goose saying you can't even play here, or through Cosmo, which now Cerebro 3 doesn't have access to, that has always sort of been the premise of Cerebro since the buff, where it's like, nice interactive deck, idiot. Good luck dealing with my 2 brains. And that is still what this deck is trying to do. Jay Walla has been trying to convince me to play Kang. I'm not overly sold on it, but like with a metagame this volatile, I guess I can see it. And it's not like Cerebro 2 has a lot of like, ooh, we must have this in here. There's not a lot of like, oh god, I can't believe he cut whatever that is. You know, it's probably fine, right? I'm not saying you should go out and craft Kang for this. In fact, I'm going to say the opposite. Don't do that. But since Cerebro 3 lost Cosmo, Cerebro 2 is the only one that is able to even execute the premise of the deck anymore. And it's not even a premise that makes a ton of sense, because if people are going to be able to go taller than you, why are you a Cerebro deck in the first place? This deck is predicated on being in a normal metagame, and we just aren't in one of those anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore. We're playing like Marvel Snap with the rails off, and this is an anti-rail deck, right? This deck is built to beat all the cards that just got nerfed. And so it's almost like, you know, like imagine Miyamoto Musashi shows up to his fateful duel with Sasaki Kojiro, and Kojiro is just already dead. It's kind of like that, where it's just like, wait, we were supposed to do something here. We didn't. There's no need for it anymore. And that's sort of how I feel about Cerebro. This also applies to Cerebro 3, probably more so because it doesn't even have the Cosmo anymore. Losing Cosmo and Negasonic and Killmonger, it's like, why even bother? Like, those are the cards that made this deck actually stand out from the pack, right? Like, we get to be a deck that plays Cosmo and Negasonic and Killmonger and previously Juggernaut and beat up on all the other mid-range dorks doing that because we have more numbers than them. That was the whole deck. And now it gets none of those cards. And you can try it, but I don't know if I buy it. Don't know what to play? You can throw some stats at the problem with Tommy's Black Knight build. This is a full-on, let's do something stupid kind of deck. There's a tech card in it. There's an Enchantress. There's a Cosmo. you could do stuff. And I think weirdly, this is one of the decks that kind of benefits from the larger stats that those cards have right now, as opposed to these smaller, more efficient, but less numbers on them kind of cards. Because a lot of what happens when you play this deck is if you don't do BK and Ghost Rider, you find yourself sort of scratching your head and being like, how do I win the other lane? And so you do get some issues I think you can run into where the extra points from your tech cards, they're still tech cards, but in those games where it matters, you'll actually just be able to play them for points. And I think that is shockingly relevant, as much as I hate to say it a decent amount of the time. This is just a pure stats and RNG deck. You are going to exploit information asymmetry. You are going to exploit the fact that you have a Quinjet that is reducing the cost of your stuff. You are largely trying to play a bunch of big guys that are a lot smaller in energy cost than they should be for their power. That's the deck. Go do that. I wanted to, I guess, commend Second Dinner for their restraint. They nerfed a million tech cards, but they didn't nerf the ones that would make the metagame instantly suck. And by that, I mean, they didn't nerf Stardust and Mobius. And I can tell you, I am positive right now that if they did nerf Stardust and Mobius in this patch to the same degree that they nerfed the other stuff, what we would be doing is playing Hela versus Mr. Negative, and it would suck. It would be one of the worst metagames we've ever played. It would be instantly terrible. I think people are already looking at this like, oh my god, everything's just gonna be about numbers. They're gonna do numbers. It's gonna be numbers. And, yes, but the typical answer when people are doing a billion numbers is to go play Mr. Negative, and we have a built-in answer to that. When people are doing a billion numbers, go play Hela, but we have an answer to that. And I think that this demonstrates, even in a techless meta, that there is some necessity for having tech around. Ladder Tribunal's in an interesting spot because, unlike other Tribunal decks, it does have a legitimate answer to Clog in the form of Misery. It's not a perfect answer to Clog. It's not even really a great answer to Clog. And your games against Clog will be like kind of down to the wire, and I think probably favoring Clog. But also, you kind of just nut all over everyone who is not meaningfully interacting with you, and there are plenty of those people running around. The downside is, I think Enchantress is probably the most played of the nerfed cards, and that's the one that beats you really, 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 really badly. So even in a metagame where I think this kind of thing should be good, I don't know if it's as good as you would expect it to be, not knowing any of the context. All right, y'all, I would categorize myself as cautiously optimistic right now. I don't think things suck nearly as much as they could just because they have kept Stardust and Mobius around. There are options in case things get really sucky, but I can see a way that this sucks if it's just like a bunch of Clog decks and a bunch of move bounce decks. That does seem like it could get pretty sucky. It's not as sucky as it could have been, but it could happen. And I'm interested to see how things develop further. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. I didn't wink. I just didn't do it.